We'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get underway here. It's just about 10 o'clock, so I think we'll get started here. I just want to say good morning and welcome everybody. My name is Mike McKay. I'm going to be your host today, and on behalf of our entire team at HalenHardy, thanks for spending some time with us this morning to discuss the new infrastructure bill and the EPA compliance initiatives. I wanted to cover in 45 seconds or less just how the webinar is laid out, what we're going to cover, and go through the chat feature and so forth. Definitely want to familiarize yourself with the chat feature on your toolbar. We want to encourage communication definitely throughout the webinar. Questions are going to be addressed during slide transitions and at the conclusion of the presentation as well. Sarah Noy, who runs and leads our client success team, is going to be managing that chat feature throughout. You're also going to have the option to get a recording of this webinar. There's going to be an email that's going to go out by the end of day this Friday, where you're going to have the option to request a recording so we can share that with you and you can share it with your colleagues or rewatch it late at a later time. In that email, you're also going to have a couple resources that we're going to provide that Karen's going to touch on today during the presentation. One's going to be a cost calculator that you're going to utilize, and also a training link for your free at your own pace training that we're going to touch on today as well. So a couple nice giveaways throughout the presentation we're going to touch on. Those are going to be dropped into the chat feature as well. But let's get started. Looking forward to today and being able to share this information. I want to introduce, at this point, Karen Hamill. We're lucky to have her today. She's got 26 years plus of experience helping EHS professionals find solutions, meet regulations and industry standards. And we're lucky to have her today. And Karen, take it away.
Thanks, Mike.
Sure.
Let's get started with the infrastructure bill. So this is something that has come out in the past 6 months, and it's something that a lot of people associated with climate change, and for good reason. A lot of the information as far as environmental concerns was structured and was centered around that infrastructure bill and centered around climate change. However, there was a large amount of money that was dedicated to environmental things that are more water related and things that are more focused and structured around general industry. And that's what we're going to look at today. So in the deal, there was $11.7 billion allocated for clean water state revolving funds. And that is kind of focused around states' efforts to improve their drinking water quality. Now, with that, we don't often associate drinking water quality with anything that we do in industry or things that we do at our facility. However, those things can be interrelated and can be tied together. So when we're looking at that, the states are having a lot more funding available to them to keep that drinking water clean and to look at those sources that the water is coming from to tie that in. So that is something that we could see industry being more heavily regulated at the state level, or having things change within NPDES permits to allow that clean water to be more drinkable and to have less impurities for that drinking public. Also, $1 billion for the Clean Water State Revolving Funds for Emerging Contaminants. This is something that we have seen the EPA working on for a while now. Particularly, they mentioned PFAS chemicals, which are a very bioaccumulative chemical. So something that once it gets into the water sources, stays in the water sources. So if we think back even 30, 40 years ago, we were looking at mercury. So now they're looking at that and they've started to clean that up. We still know that mercury is in the environment. It's something that just doesn't leave the water once it gets there. PFAS is something that is in that nature. So they're looking at those different contaminants that have the potential to pollute the water and what they can do to keep those out of water sources. So again, something that could affect facilities when they are renewing their NPDES permits, when they're looking at those different water plans that are enacted at a facility. could affect facilities in that way. 1.9 billion for regional water conservancy programs. This is a lot of focus around our national treasure waters. So looking at the Great Lakes, looking at the Chesapeake Bay, looking at all those big regional water programs and how we're going to improve the water quality in those. We've seen a lot of efforts made, especially in the past 10 years on that. And this is just giving that more funding so that it continues so that we can restore those waters for recreational uses, for other uses as each of those states and areas see fit. And also $1 million, $100 million for the P2 program. And we're going to talk more about the P2 program in detail because it affects a lot of the things that you're already doing with planning. So in general, this means that the EPA has gotten a lot more funding at both the federal and state levels so that they can do more compliance efforts, so that they can make more enforcement efforts, and also so that they can introduce new programs that will help keep water cleaner, make water cleaner, remove pollutants, and just make those resources more viable for the future. So let's look particularly at the EPA's P2 program. The P2 program comes from an act that Congress passed in 1990, and it is something that through the past several decades, EPA has actually tried to create a P2 regulation. It has gotten into sort of a proposed state a few times, but it's never really come to pass as a regulation. And a lot of reasons for that. When you look at what's in the P2 Act, it's all about pollution prevention, and there are a lot of things in other regulations that kind of already have that aspect in it. So rather than have industry have a separate plan or a separate program that specifically is part of P2, you see that incorporated into a lot of other things, and we'll look at some of those. So P2 in general is encouraging industry and encouraging facilities to, and also the government entities, to look at ways to prevent that pollution before it is even created. So we hear a lot about reuse, recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle. However, this is kind of taking that a step back and saying, what can we do to prevent that pollution from even becoming a pollutant, from even becoming a waste? So looking at our production schedules, can we look at those schedules a little bit differently so that we're not having a lot of changeover and having a lot of waste with it? What are our operations that are generating the waste? Are there ways that we can reformulate things? Are there ways that we can reuse things, put them back into our processes? Do we always need to use raw materials? If so, are we using those most efficiently? Those are all things that factor into P2. And just looking at those ways that we can stop it from happening so that we don't have a waste to deal with. So pollution prevention are practices that, as I mentioned, they're looking at things before recycling, treatment, or disposal, looking at ways to reduce the amount of waste that is generated. And again, that ounce of prevention approach. So if we have less waste, we have less waste to deal with. That means we have less opportunities for pollution because if we're not putting it into a landfill, if we're not treating it, we don't have that volume to deal with. And also we'll have fewer public health hazards. So when we look at the longevity of a landfill, if it's not properly landfilled, if they don't have the proper liners in there, that can present hazards to people down the road. If we're looking at deep ground injection for any of our waste, again, less waste means less opportunity for that to become a public health issue. So it includes technologies, it includes reformulation. Think of the efforts that have been made to remove chlorinated solvents from different processes. 30, 40 years ago, it was common for people to use a chlorinated solvent just to degrease a part. Now we have found alternative methods for that. We can use traditional solvents that don't have a chlorinated base to them, or there are even a lot of citrus-based solvents. So looking at those redesigns, something that does the job just as well, but doesn't have those heavier pollution issues. Substituting raw materials. So this could be looking at how different products are formulated, what we can do to prevent those things from polluting the environment after we're done with them. Improving housekeeping. So this could be making sure that when we are bringing in our raw materials, we bring in enough for the process that we're doing, but we don't have a ton of extra left over that then becomes a waste. properly maintaining machines, properly maintaining processes so that they work at peak performance, so that they are not having byproducts and having air emissions. Training our personnel so that they're doing things properly and they're not dumping things in the backyard unintentionally. Controlling inventory, so again, we don't have that waste. A lot of those different things that we incorporate, a lot of times these things also factor into lean manufacturing efforts and other efforts that we're making just to make our processes more secure and to make our processes less wasteful. P2 can be included in a lot of those. P2 is not recycling, it's not energy recovery, and it's not disposal. Again, these things are all good. These things are all important, but at this point you have created that waste, and P2 is kind of taking, again, that step back and saying, how can we not create it in the first place? And just like we've always heard with the hierarchy, of course, we want to recycle when we can. We want to treat it and reuse it if we can. And disposal, if we do have to take that option, of course, we want it to be in the most responsible manner, but those things are not specifically included in your P2 efforts. And also, as we look at the new focuses for industry on sustainability and looking at a lot of companies have embraced the zero waste concept. If we make those P2 efforts in the beginning, then we don't have to worry as much about that zero waste on the back end. So again, we mentioned that $100 million has been allocated to help businesses with those P2 efforts, and they can be used in a lot of different ways. Some of the ones that they mentioned within the bill were reducing toxic pollutants. So that could be looking at using different solvents, using different raw materials, using things that are less hazardous to begin with, so that we're not generating those products to be used within our processes. Cutting our water usage. Is there a better way that we can recycle that water, reclaim that water, reuse that water, so that we're not always pulling in virgin water to cool a process or to warm a process? Looking at operating costs, of course, operating costs figure into everything we do when we're looking to make a profit. So the more that we can do that within the system, that can help us with those pollution prevention efforts as well. And the special focus here is on underserved and overburdened communities. And the reason for that is the EPA has found that traditionally there are higher amounts of pollutants. There are more landfills within areas that are less attractive to business and less available. So making sure that those communities that do have to deal with this have the resources that they need to prevent that pollution, keep their water safe, and keep their communities safe. Why is P2 important? Because when you look at the different costs associated with producing a product, anytime you produce a waste, that of course takes away from the bottom line. So if you are able to prevent that waste from happening, you don't have to deal with it. Whether it ends up being a solid waste or a hazardous waste, there's still an associated cost with managing that and with dealing with it as a waste. So the more that we can reduce that and prevent that from prevent whatever you've got in your process from becoming a waste, the less it's going to cost you to have to deal with it and maintain it for forever after that. Also, protection for the environment. So when we're able to better protect the environment, we have less fines associated with that. We have less remediation costs in the future. We have less of a responsibility to make sure that we are safeguarding that environment if we haven't done anything to harm it in the first place. So what P2 factors into? I mentioned before that there have been occasions where the EPA has tried to pass that P2 Act and create legislation and create regulations around it. But the reason, one of the big reasons is that it is already sort of a part of a lot of different things. So the first one is the National Environmental Policy Act. And this is an act that was passed that is mainly focused around government contracts and making sure that when the government purchases things, they are looking at things that have recycled content, or they are looking at things that are environmentally preferred. So if you do have government contracts working with that, that National Environmental Policy Act may be something that you are more familiar with. And P2 does factor into that. The Clean Air Act, pollution prevention is part of that, and it's mainly focused around those air emissions. So we're looking at things that if we're using cleaner materials, if we're using less hazardous materials, that's fewer scrubbers that we might need before we are emitting that effluent into the air. So things of that nature factor into the Clean Air Act and associated regulations. Within the Clean Water Act, two of the big things that we see there, the first one is the Stormwater program. So your NPDES permit, if we're able to prevent pollution and we're using less hazardous materials, that's going to factor into our effluents for our water as well. So also SPCC is a big one there. So if we are making sure that we've got good records and we're keeping track of how we store our fuel, how we store our oils, making sure we don't have emissions there. That's all going to factor into preventing that pollution within the Clean Water Act and within those two programs. In EPCRA, the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, this program was put together, these regulations were put together for facilities that have extremely hazardous materials on site within or above threshold quantities. Within that program, the more we can take care of those pollutants, keep them in track, the less they're getting into our communities and potentially harming the public. For RCRA, this RCRA, of course, is all about hazardous waste. So the less hazardous waste we generate, the less we have to manage, the less we have to recycle, treat, or dispose of. And also that can affect our generator status. So within RCRA, if you can reduce the amount of hazardous waste you're creating, the regulations become less stringent for you. So if you can move from a large quantity generator into a small or conditionally exempt generator, those are all kind of goals to have so that you don't have as much regulation based on the fact that you don't have as much pollutant in the air. And even FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, within FIFRA, when you're dealing with pesticides, anytime you can use a less hazardous one, it's advantageous because it does have less of an effect on the land and on the water. So P2 is factoring into all of those, and with EPA now having more funding for that program, it is something that we may start to see more efforts being made, especially as we're looking at permitting. They may make more efforts to kind of tighten those guidelines or tighten those limitations on what can be put into the air, the water, or the land. Next, I'm going to talk about some national compliance initiatives. And these are things that the EPA looks at. So when they're looking at funding, when they're looking at their budgets, when they're looking at kind of their future planning, every 4 years, they put out usually anywhere from 6 to 12 compliance initiatives. And these are things that they especially want to focus on. So they are things that they maybe have found lax in the years past, or they're things that they really think that if they focus on, they can kind of move that needle and create a better environment for everyone in America. So the ones that we're going to look at are focused around water and focused around chemical releases. And the first one is specifically about reducing the chance for spills or accidental releases at chemical and industrial facilities. And specifically, we're going to look at the general duty clause plans. So if you go back to the Clean Air Act, within the Clean Air Act, the Congress set aside or appropriated and required both OSHA and the EPA to come up with a list of toxic chemicals and require facilities to have plans to prevent those toxic chemicals from getting into the environment. So on the OSHA side, the process safety management standard was created for any facility that had above threshold quantities of those toxic of the listed toxic chemicals to create a plan that kept their workers safe, that kept their employees safe from the effects of those chemicals, whether they were breathing them in, whether it was something that could be ingested, whatever that harm was, basically having that plan to keep the worker safe when they're working around it within their facility. On the EPA side, that became known as the Risk Management Plan Requirements. Again, same list, well, almost the same list of chemicals between OSHA and EPA. And if you had an above threshold quantity of those chemicals, you had to create a plan. So you had to do a hazard analysis. You had to look at a lot of different things within that plan. However, one thing that is often missed is if you look at the OSHA list and you look at the EPA list and you say, oh gosh, I don't have any threshold quantities of those really hazardous chemicals, I don't need a plan. They also threw in the general duty clause found in section 112R. And the general duty clause is kind of that catch-all. So if you don't fall into the category where you need a process safety management or a risk management plan, chances are you may need that general duty clause plan. And it is for facilities that have extremely hazardous materials, regardless of the quantity. So just by virtue of having it on site, you may need that general duty plan. And it's something that a lot of facilities miss. In fact, I once had the opportunity to take a class from a regional EPA inspector, and his entire job was going out to facilities and helping them write, construct, and become compliant with the general duty clause, because he said most people just don't know they need to do it because they looked at the list, they didn't need that RMP, they didn't need the PSM plan, but they weren't aware they kind of missed this general duty clause. So we are seeing a lot more enforcement in that area and a lot more inspectors looking at the need for that general duty clause plan. So what is an extremely hazardous substance? It's not really defined in regulation. When the act was passed, they said they used the term extremely hazardous substance, but they never defined it within the requirements. And EPA does not have a strict definition for it either. The Senate did kind of put this in their report that it could be any agent that's listed that has exposures, but they have really kind of expanded that with interpretation to include a lot of different things. So some of the things that you may look for or may help you determine if you've got an extremely hazardous substance and you need that general duty clause plan. If you have anything on the TSCA inventory list, you probably need this plan. If NIOSH has it listed, so this could be something that it's in the NIOSH guidebook, you need to check respiratory limits for, that could be an EHS or extremely hazardous substance. If OSHA has information on it, NFPA. So this would be mainly flammable liquids, of course, the CDC or the ACGIH. So the ACGIH, they've done a lot of work with threshold limit values and ceilings for different kinds of pollutants. If there is anybody out, any kind of recognized agency out there that has any sort of guidance on a chemical, that could be an indicator that it's an extremely hazardous substance. Other things that may facilitate that, if you have a HAZCOM program. So if you've got hazardous chemicals on site and you have a HAZCOM program, that could be an indicator. If you have an SPCC plan, an NPDES permit, or if you submit Tier 2 reports under EPCRA, these could all be indicators that you've got an EHS on site. Again, may not be in threshold quantity, may not be something that you're specifically planning for, but this could indicate that you do need that general duty plan. The good news about a general duty clause plan is that chances are you've already got all the elements covered somewhere else. It's just a matter of making sure that they're all in line and you can pull those out if you ever were to have an inspection. So you need to identify and assess your hazards. So this could be in the form of a job safety analysis, a JSA, or a job hazard analysis, JHA, a lot of different ways to do those. Basically looking at your processes, looking at your procedures, and saying, okay, what is hazardous about them and what am I doing to protect myself in the environment? And just outlining those things so that you've got a record of them. The second element of a general duty clause plan is to design and maintain a safe facility. So this is probably also something that you're doing already. You've got processes and procedures in place that are going to keep your workers safe and going to prevent spills and protect the environment. So it could be just a matter of taking those from other plans and reorganizing them for this plan. And the third is to be prepared for spills. So making sure that you've got the tools, the resources, the people, the training, everything in place so that when there is a spill, you're able to take care of it quickly so that it doesn't get into the environment. It doesn't harm either your workers or the public. So mostly elements that you should be familiar with from other things, but having those together so that if you ever do have a general duty clause inspection, you have them ready for an inspector. The next compliance enforcement area is non-compliance dischargers. And this is stemming from NPDES permits. So when you look at a lot of the permitting out there, a lot of people are covered under general permits, but there are 46,000 entities that have individual permits. And when you have an individual permit, the limitations that you have for anything that is getting into any pollutants that are getting into the water are individually marked within that permit. And they found that more than 20.3% of facilities were in non-compliance. So when they made this a compliance initiative, they specified that the facility size doesn't matter. So when we think of permitting and especially individual permits, and we think of EPA coming to inspect us, we usually think of those big smokestacks, those larger facilities. But they have found that it doesn't necessarily have to be the big smokestacks that are creating the biggest amount of non-compliance. So they're saying that if you're non-compliant, and if you've been non-compliant for several years, you have an equal opportunity. We're not just looking at the big guys for this compliance initiative. So the violations could be that we know that we have to do our periodic reporting when we have an NPDES permit. So they're looking at those permits, they're looking at those reports and saying, you know what, you've exceeded your limitations for several months or several years now. That's a violation. We need to look at what you're doing. We need to look at possibly restructuring your SWIP, your stormwater pollution prevention plan, so that you're not having those exceedances. Maybe you need new filters, maybe you need new processes, maybe you need more training, whatever it is. Looking at what can be done so that you get to be within the terms of your permit. Also looking at people that aren't filing their reports. So the reason they're looking at that is, why aren't you filing your reports? Is it just that you don't know you need to? Or is it that you know that you've had an exceedance and you don't want to be punished for it? So looking at the why to help people become more compliant with that requirement. So between the compliance initiatives and the new funding, in the fiscal year 2022 budget, the EPA has noted that they want to hire 1,000 more compliance and enforcement officers. So if you look at that in regards to the monies that have now been allocated, that means that there's a lot more opportunity for somebody to come out and help with compliance, or it also means that there are more compliance officers and enforcement officers out there to kind of put you on more of an alert for the need to look at your programs and make sure that what you're doing is in line with what you say is in your plan, and also to keep you out of trouble if somebody does come knocking on your door. So now I want to move into some tools and services that we offer that can help you improve those pollution prevention plans. Specifically looking at maybe your SWIP, your stormwater pollution prevention plan, that you outline what you're going to do to keep in line with your NPDES permits, SPCC, or stormwater pollution control and countermeasures plan. So if you've got large amounts of oil or fuel on site, EPCRA. If you have any tier 2 chemicals, RCRA, and your RMP or general duty class plans. Looking at those specifically because pollution prevention does play into a lot of those. So the first one is a task that could fall into any of the plans on the left of your screen there, capturing oil leaks and drips from outdoor piping and equipment. When we store things outdoors, when we have piping outdoors, we all know that from time to time it can leak and drip. And in fact, I've often heard from a number of different facilities that if it's not leaking, it's not working. I don't know that I necessarily buy into that, but we do know that those outdoor oil leaks and drips do present a problem, and they are something that could be factored into a lot of different planning elements. So when we are looking at that, there are different things that we can do to take care of that. We can create secondary containment systems. We can throw kitty litter under it. There are many different things that we can do to take care of it. And the better able we are to maintain those things, the less remediation we have to do, and the better we are able to prevent oil sheens from then getting into our water systems. So this is, Mike mentioned earlier that we will be providing you with a cost calendar, and it's a tool that we have developed for you to use so that you can put in the costs of what you're doing and compare them with changing up your methods or looking at improved methods to handle a situation more effectively, both from a cost standpoint and from a time and labor standpoint. So if you're currently using white spill pads to do this task, to put under machines, to put under equipment, to put under leaky pipes, this is what it can cost you if you've got 10 areas. It could be $37,000, where if you look at replacing it with a Husky pan, it's going to save you a lot of money in labor costs and also create a lot less waste for you. Also, it's going to help you prevent the need to go out and dig up that soil and everything underneath those pads that became contaminated. So this is something that you can use in the cost calculator. See what it is costing you to do it whatever way you're currently doing, and see if you can save money by changing methods, updating your plans, and updating those resources. Area that factors into a lot of plans are draining secondary containment systems. Secondary containment systems are a great feature. They're something that they're a nice safeguard because they are always in place. If a spill does happen, you don't have to worry about it getting into a neighboring area because it's all contained. That's kind of the point of a secondary containment system. Great passive method that EPA looks for, and EPA is very happy to see those systems in place because they do prevent so many spills from getting into waterways. However, they do take time to maintain. And a lot of times the maintenance for these involves somebody going out and manually draining the system. If you've got systems that hold 10,000 gallons or even systems that only hold 500 gallons, they can take a lot of time to drain, sometimes 3, 4, 5, even 6 hours. And that means somebody has to sit there and physically watch that water come out of the valve, which can be really boring for a lot of people to do. So when you are looking at that current method, consider the amount of time and the amount of drains that you've got within your system and how much labor cost you have involved with somebody sitting there watching a valve uh, drain. Also consider the amount of cost for vacuum trucks. So if you do come upon a system and there is an oil sheen, of course, you can't discharge that because oil is present within the system. Consider the costs involved with having somebody pump out that system each time that oil sheen is present. And those things can slowly start to add up to a lot of cost involved with draining secondary containment systems. Innovative method that we have introduced is the Drainiac oil filter valve system. And this is a system that allows the secondary containment system to drain, but it will filter out and remove any oil so that you don't have any kind of a discharge. In the event of a spill, it's going to automatically close off so that no oil is just discharged. So it's a nice fail safe, helps prevent any valves from being left open, helps keep those systems clear, helps prevent mosquitoes from forming in the summer. Just a nice way to improve that system and reduce those labor costs as well. Another thing that factors into a lot of plans are maintaining storm drains. Of course, storm drains for most people are that last line of defense, that last chance to capture any oil, sediment, and debris before it is discharged into a public water system or into a stream, river, or wherever that receiving water may be. So we see this factor into our NPDES permitting. We see it factoring into SPCC plans, especially when we have the potential for oil sheens over a large area. And it can even factor into your risk management plan or general duty clause. This is something that is becoming more and more important on construction sites as well. So if you're doing any kind of large construction project, making sure that you're keeping things out of those storm drains is becoming a big enforcement focus. A lot of different ways to do that. We've seen it done with sandbags. We've seen it done with silt fences. We've seen it done with a witch's hat drain inserts. All different ways to do that. Effectiveness can vary, but there are ways, again, to save money and save time and labor costs. The next one is removing oil stains and sheens from paved areas. This is something that the EPA is really looking at because it's kind of that low-hanging fruit. If you're going into a paved yard or a paved parking area or a paved area that has materials stored there, it's very easy to see those oil sheens, especially if it has recently rained and the ground is still wet. So this is kind of that low-hanging fruit that they're looking for, because those oil stains and those sheens that are happening on the paved area indicate that something isn't going right, and they start to indicate a lack of maintenance and things that the EPA may want to look harder into when they visit a facility. So being able to maintain that, keep those oil stains and sheens off of your paved surfaces is going to help you if you do have an inspection, or even if somebody is driving by. It's something that citizens notice as well. So it's something that if you want to maintain that public image, you want to kind of keep those things off of the ground. One of the most common ways to do it is to have somebody come in and steam clean or pressure wash that. And that does cost a lot of money. So also you're introducing a lot of chemicals to the process. And if those aren't captured correctly, they do get into the water system and they can cause pollution problems as well. So looking at those methods and looking at improved methods to do that, that will reduce the amount of waste that is created and help save you time and money, keep those surfaces looking great, and not have to worry about calling somebody in every time you've got a sheen on the pavement. Plans. Contingency plans are something that figure into just about every plan that you've got out there. So yes, we plan for the best. Yes, we train our people. Yes, we do all of these proactive things so that we're not creating a waste, so that we're not generating any kind of process. But we all know that spills happen. Spills happen daily. If you look at the National Response Center, these are just spills that have to be reported. Spills are reported on an average of 20 to 30 per hour every single day, 364 5 days a year. So there's something that happens quite often throughout North America, and something that EPA requires you to plan for, so that when they do happen, you're ready to go and you have the resources, tools, and training that you need to make that happen. A lot of people will plan for large spills by hiring a spill contractor and keeping them on retainer. That can be very expensive. And one thing with a contractor, contractors are great. They're very knowledgeable. They're skilled. They have great resources, but they do take time to get there. And that time can still leave you in a lurch, and there are a lot of things that your employees can do until that contractor gets there to help prevent those spills from getting off site, so that when the contractor does get there, they're able to respond quickly and know that efforts have already been in place. So one thing that you can do is get those frontline employees on board. Make sure that they have the resources and tools that they need where the spill is most likely to happen. So having those small spill kits, those small resources available to them, can really help with your contingency planning and make those efforts a lot more fruitful. And the last area is required trainings. There are a lot of trainings that are required in the regulation. For example, SPCC, anybody who handles oil products has to have an annual training. Within your NPDES permit, part of the resources, one of your best management practices might be to keep your people trained on the practices and procedures that they're using to prevent pollution. If you are a large quantity waste generator, you must have required training for all of your employees who are handling hazardous waste. All those different things are designed to make sure that the people who are working with the chemicals or materials that can present a problem, or create that pollution hazard, know what they're doing and know how to handle both everyday situations as well as unusual or uncommon events such as spills. So an example that we pulled out for you here is that oil handler training for SPCC oil handlers. And there are a lot of costs associated. Even if you're doing your training in-house, it still can be very problematic to try to get everybody on site at one time and in one place. We have vacations, we have scheduling conflicts, a lot of different things play into the ability to actually gather everyone for a training session. And costs associated with that can easily be $10,000 for 100 employees when you look at all the different labor costs and things involved in that. And this is assuming that you've got a trainer on site who is able to conduct that training and you don't have to pull those resources in from an outside source. We have actually put together an oil handler training program that you can offer to employees at no cost on mobile platforms, tablets, wherever it's convenient for them. So you don't have the onus to pull everybody in at the same time and same place to get that training done and meet that requirement. So again, we've put these things into a cost comparison calculator, and this is something that we hope that you will use when you are looking at different BMPs that you've got within your different plans. If you're looking at process and procedures, looking for ways to improve them, this is a tool that we hope that will be useful for you to see what you're currently spending, both in product and labor costs, and see if you can see a cost savings by improving those methods or changing up what you're currently doing. And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions that may be out there.
Thank you, Karen. That's great information. I think there's where I have a couple questions for you. We've been hearing more about ESG. Can you share some examples of how organizations are establishing strategic kind of ESG roadmaps and framework? It's coming up more and more. We're hearing more about it. Would you mind sharing that?
Sure, I'd love to. ESG is, if for anybody who's not familiar with it, ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. And it is actually being driven by business. So it is a topic that a lot of businesses are looking at because it is important not only to the public, but also to shareholders. So within the environmental realm, they're looking at it. The nice thing about it is ESG is scalable to any organization. So when you're looking at ESG topics, it could be the fact that you are looking for zero waste. It could be the fact that you are introducing your wastes back into your process so that you're better able to achieve that zero waste. It could be that you are using less hazardous materials, whatever that means for you, within the environmental realm, it is scalable so that if you're just getting started, you can see success. But if you've been doing this and you have sustainability efforts in place, it's something that you can always grow to and you can always better. Within the social realm, this could be anything from employment practices. This could be hiring a diverse workforce. It's those worker issues, human resource issues, making sure that your company is ethically in place, and governance, making sure that you're compliant not only with regulations, but you're aware of other standards that might be out there that help better your processes and better your ability to do whatever meet whatever standards are out there within your different facility. So it's a great effort that's being made. A lot of environmental health and safety professionals are now being pulled into that realm. So if you're in that realm, it's something that you're either hearing now or you will be hearing soon in the future. And the nice thing about it is there are a lot of metrics that we are already tracking that figure into that. So it's nice to see those things kind of coming and being put together within, they're not so much silos anymore. They're all being seen holistically.
For sure. Thank you, Karen. And I think that the theme of today too is the planning and prepared, right? I mean, it seems like it could be pretty broad. Where we just wanted to come on today, Karen. Thank you very much. This is valuable information. If there's no questions, we're going to conclude. Give people a few minutes back of their day. But in conclusion, just want to take a few seconds here and go over what's next. So you're going to see an email, everybody that attended today. We're going to be for an early sign-in for early registration, rather, for a January 26th webinar. We're going to focus that. This is really the first time we've talked about it publicly out in front of the curtain, but we're going to be focusing on dams, coffer dams, underflow dams, So there's more details to come there, but it's exciting. We're going to do this monthly, and we appreciate everybody being here. Again, that you'll receive that cost calculator that Karen went through today in an email by Friday of this week. You'll also receive that link that Sarah put into the chat in that email as well. So just want to thank everybody for being here. And we're here to help as a team. I mean, reach out to your representative if you're currently working with us. Reach out to our team. There's contact information on the next slide here. But we look forward to working with you. And thanks again for taking some time out of your day today. And from all of us at HalenHardy, happy holidays. And we wish you the best. Thanks again.